I'm live. You're live. We're all live. Okay. Hi, everybody. This is Hillel, and this is Overthinking Comics. And I'm going to mess with this thing until it falls off. Okay, there we go. So, I'm Hillel, and this is Brian, and we're here to talk about comics, and we're going to overthink them. And if steam doesn't come out of our ears, then we're doing something wrong. Okay, or maybe I should say steam isn't coming out of your ears. If at some point you don't just go like this and you have a blank look on your face, it means we haven't affected your brain enough for you to, not be able to process any more information. So this week we decided we're going to focus on the Crime Syndicate, specifically in the Earth 2 book written by Grant Morrison with the art with Frank Quitely. Excuse me. This is one of my favorite representations of them. Let me just give you a background. Usually Brian's giving the background, but this is one group that I know a lot more about than he does. So he's gonna give us some cliff notes on a couple of things, but I'll just give you some background. So the Crime Syndicate comes from another Earth, and where things are the opposite. I think originally they were part of the antimatter universe, or just another Earth. I don't recall that. No, it wasn't because the Cordians were the. Yeah, okay, so. But they were essentially the opposite evil doppelgangers of the DC universe. So instead of Superman, they had Ultraman. Instead of Wonder Woman, they had Superwoman. Instead of Batman, they had Owlman. Instead of the Flash, they had Johnny Quick. And instead of Green Lantern, they had Power Ring. And some of the interesting things about these guys is that some of their powers they had the same powers, but they got them in different ways. For example, Ultraman, instead of being a baby who was the last person of Krypton who came to Earth, he was actually an Earthman who became an astronaut, went to space, and aliens took his ship, experimented on him, and gave him Superman-like powers, and then he killed the aliens. And so after that, he came back to Earth. Superwoman is actually Lois Lane, and who winds up with Amazonian-like powers. Owlman is, I don't know if he's Bruce or if he's Thomas Wayne, but he's a Wayne, and he just, instead of using it for doing good things, he actually he becomes more like a gangster, if you will. Now. Power Ring is interesting because his ring is more of a curse. Green Lantern gets his ring to protect everyone, but Power Ring gets more or less tricked into it, and he gets stuck with this curse sort of. That's this ring, so it gives him amazing power, but it's also driving crazy. And Johnny Quick is their version of the Flash. Now, I can't say that their origins are consistent. But the interesting thing in Quietly's version is that Johnny Quick gets his super speed from a drug, and he's an addict, and he actually has to shoot up in order to have his super speed, which was an interesting bit on this. So the Crime Syndicate comes from a universe where morality is flipped on its head. What we call good, they would call evil, and what we call evil, they would call good. So they live in a universe where instead of caring about justice, they're effectively the number one top mob organization in the world. They're sort of the super mob, which is what they call the Crime Syndicate. They have an uneasy alliance. They realize that they could control the Earth better, make more money, have more things, have more power if they work together. There have been different ways of different times where the Crime Syndicate and Justice League have met each other. They've crossed over a few different times. My first introduction to the Crime Syndicate was in the Crisis on Infinite Earths, when their universe is being eaten by the opposite universe, the antimatter universe's whatever that stuff was. It's eating it up, and Ultraman, realizing he can't stop it, just decides he's going to fly right into it. He flies into it and effectively dies. And we don't hear from the Crime Syndicate for years. Before that, they fought the JLA a few times. In Quietly's rendering of all of this, he has it so that he does something odd, which is he says that in the JLA universe, Justice League universe, good always wins eventually, and and evil always fails. But in his universe, evil always wins eventually, and good always fails. And you're crazy if you're a good guy, and you make a lot of sense if you're a bad guy. Everybody's corrupt, everybody's evil, unless you're crazy. And so, of course, in this universe, Lex Luthor is a good guy. But what you wind up realizing is he's not a good guy for good reasons. He's a good guy for his own reasons. So he's still, in a sense, selfish. It's just that his selfishness pushed him towards justice. And he doesn't explain this until he has to find out about it later on. The protagonist in this actually is not the Crime Syndicate. It's actually Brainiac. Brainiac has hatched a plan, and it ends up taking the Crime Syndicate and the JLA to overcome him. Here is what I really liked about Quietly and Morrison's take on the Crime Syndicate, is that I could see that Morrison was wanting to look at morality, and he gave us sort of black and white versions on both ends of it. So for the moral universe, he wants to say that good always wins, and that things that the way we think about things morally is much more or less intact. But in the opposite universe, everything's flipped on its head. Instead of talking about God in the heavens, they talk about the God below, and they have almost a satanic sort of worship of, I guess, the devil. I don't know, and they're always it's a statement: God below, God below. This is what they say when things when things go awry. The Crime Syndicate and its world works based on an idea of favors, things that you do, because otherwise the problem you have where the criminals are running everything is how do you keep society functioning. And so to make this interesting, the world has to be a dark reflection of our world, but that means that you still need to have on some level a world that works pretty much the same as it does in our world. And so he introduces this idea that you've got favors or whatever else, and that's more or less a currency. That's the way they hold society together. It's an interesting idea. I don't think it would ever work, and maybe Morrison knows that. He just wants to look at this, morality, because if morality is the way he portrays it in the book, the morality is arbitrary. There's no absolute wrong and no absolute right, because ultimately morality is a construct. If you're an atheist, I think that's the way you look at the world. Is morality is an artificial construct. It's not cemented to anything above and beyond the natural world. There's no natural law. There's only every man for himself, I guess, in one sense. But then he introduces this element, Brainiac, and Brainiac in both universes is the same person. He acts according to logic and what he wants to do, and so his plan is neither moral or amoral. I mean, it's amoral, I guess, it's without a moral viewpoint. But it's not even the selfishness that the Crime Syndicate operates under. So I find this very interesting. This is where he takes the story. This is a period of time. They have Morrison. Excuse me. They had a new roster. They I believe they more or less started the JLA over. I think they just called it the JLA. They didn't call it Justice League. They called it the JLA. And and you had Martian Man, Aquaman with the hook, Plastic Man, and then you had your typical Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman, and the Kyle Rayner Green Lantern. Um, but so it was an interesting. I liked this version of Justice League. I enjoyed the stories that he had that he told with these. So that's just a quick overview. Brian, any thoughts so far? Anything you want to share?
Yeah, great synopsis. That seems to be what I've come across. I mean, I guess the big story here is the inversion, like you mentioned. Alexander Luthor on face seems to be good, but you find it's more for selfish reasons, possibly. Um, Jim Gordon, who was traditionally, the good guy, a good guy,
Yeah,
is now a crime boss. Yeah, you mentioned Thomas Wayne Jr. He's the Owl Man. I think there was it's funny. Two things that stuck out was one of the injection. We previously talked about the Flash series, TV series by WB, and I believe they
yeah,
paid homage to that idea with the injections later on in the seasons with
right,
Jay Garrick, who doubles as Zoom, how he was taking injections in order to get the
right.
Speed Force rather than it coming organically. So I think that story wove itself, continued to weave itself through different tales. And then you did mention Superwoman, and I believe she was married to Ultraman in this universe, and also there was some infidelity with the Owlman between
Right.
her and the Owlman. So you really have a very very different, darker version of the team here.
Well, and Superwoman and Ultraman actually hate each other.
Right,
They seem to hate each other.
right. Well, there's always been a tension between Batman and Superman. Batman never trusting Clark 100% because had he gone rogue, who could really stop him? And there was always these contingency plans the Batman had, which comes to play in other storylines in which these plans are preyed upon by others. But in any event, yeah, there's always a tension between those two. I think they really amplified that in the Earth 2 series.
Well, I meant more between Ultraman and Superwoman. They were
Oh,
married, but they hate each other in the
I
book.
see what you're saying. Yeah, it wasn't a great relationship, huh? And maybe that's just another version. Good is bad and bad is
Well,
good.
I think that's exactly it. Like I think that ultimately, I mean, it's a mockery of everything that's normal
Right.
to us. And I don't know Grant Morrison, and other than the JLA, I've never really read much by him. But so I don't know. I can't say this is his, his style, or he's got a point with this, or what he really believes.
Mm,
I think that wherever he stands, at the very least, it was an interesting story. I thought, obviously when I read it, as much as I enjoyed it, I kept thinking, well, this would never work. You could never have a universe like this that would work. You know,
right.
it would just end up burning. Everybody would go crazy
Hmm.
and he has a little bit. Like it seems like the world is always on the verge of tearing itself apart. But I don't know. You know, what do you think of that? What do you think about this?
Well, in in my prep for this, I kind of went over some of my notes in philosophy, just because I think we're dealing with the concept of good and evil. I mean, how you apply good and evil, what is good and evil? I mean, these are all questions people have. Um, I think, like you were mentioned, like for instance, Pythagoras, he's going to say that the man is the measure of all things, and that morals are somewhat individualistic and conventional. And this is kind of the
Yeah,
whole sophist idea, um, which some people may ascribe to that, but I think truly ethical people somewhat reject that. That you know we can't have morality as just some you know indiscriminate personal tool. I mean, Socrates, he's going to later come and say good and evil has to be beyond individualistic confines. I think we all agree with that. He comes and says knowledge is the ultimate good. And he says this interesting quote that no man is voluntarily bad. Um, I think that's just a fascinating idea.
Mhm.
Maybe I don't agree, maybe I do, but just the idea that sometimes when we do something that's considered bad or evil, it may be that we're focusing on a narrow aspect um, of our own desire rather than a wider education on the topic or issue at hand. Um, so,
Hey, Greg.
moving on, we have Plato is going to say that that since our senses are somewhat relative, they're unreal and therefore evil, and that only ideas are the ultimate good because they can stand the test of time, and that he's going to say that reason is the highest goal, and that the good life is to rule one's appetites, one's desires, and ultimately become wise. Aristotle kind of dovetails on that, and of course, we call it the golden mean. That is a medium
It's by the
between these
middle.
extremes, and
Yeah.
he's going to also see the harmony or see the idea of harmonizing extremes in your appetites and things. I think it's when we get to Philo, for instance, he's going to say that God is so holy and pure, and that matter is evil, and then we're going to have this interesting bifurcation that I think kind of trickles through a lot of Christian thinking. For instance, Thomas Aquinas, he's going to write a lot about the contempt for the world, that
Yeah.
somehow the world is evil and needs to be escaped. Therefore, piety is, say, somewhat like a monk in a monastery, which is very opposite to Torah concepts, which we can get to later. I think Hobbes is going to come back to the idea of convention, that good and evil is convention, that pleasure is good and pain is evil. And I think we see a lot of these themes kind of run through these stories. I got two more that I wanted to hit real quick. Spinoza, he's going to say that error in general, or the evil in general, is due to lack of knowledge. I think that kind of goes back to Socrates. And he's going to seek intelligence and strive for the good. And then we have, I think our more modern concepts is maybe Immanuel Kant, who's going to give this universalist idea that you should act as if your conduct might become, a universal axiom. And I think a lot of people, might see that as a good measuring stick, or at least a beginning to the discussion of morality versus immorality.
I think, just talking about morality and immorality in general. And I don't know if you're not into philosophy, this is probably the wrong show for you, because we're going to talk about this. It's an interesting book.
Right.
The JLA Earth 2 book is just interesting for this very reason. This is why I picked it, was because it does get into these deeper issues. But with the questions of morality and how we understand it. Have you ever noticed that there's never been, as far as I know of, there's never been a philosopher who has offered a effective or practical ethical system?
Yeah, that's
They
ultimately
come
what
up with
led. It's ultimately what led me to Torah, is because rather than like abstract beliefs or thoughts or philosophies, we see at the giving of the Torah to the at Sinai to the Jewish people, we see not 10 dogmas, but in fact we see 10 commandments. We see 10 rigid, concrete ideas of divine implementation of our human faculties.
right and going the philosophic route. And I just say the philosophic route. I'm not really uh, talking about religion per se right now, because I think that you mentioned several philosophers who view morality as a construct, um, and they view and for those, I think ultimately, if you don't believe in God, that's what you have to believe. But
Hmm.
I think one of the criticism atheists have about religious people is that uh, religious people claim that atheists don't have are not moral, and that's in spite of the fact that they feel like they're very moral.
Mhm.
And I think, because I've talked to a few atheists about this, and I think there's a difference in moral habits that you inherited from your parents versus having your own moral system that you stick to no matter what. Atheism does not breed morality. It doesn't create morality. It typically, veers further and further away from your morality over time. And if not, and really what determines how moral an atheist is often, the values they were raised with.
Right.
But the second, third generation, and they don't have, they don't have a foundation for why should I care? First of all, atheists are very big on philanthropy, and they feel like they have a responsibility to take care of people. But when your child comes and asks you why is it important to take care of people, you say, oh, because they're human beings, and we should respect other human beings, and we should yada yada yada. All the kid all can hear is why. That doesn't really answer my question. Hi, Sketchbook. Sketchbook just came in, and you haven't told me why I should care. Why should I be motivated to give? And just saying I should feel this way. Why? There is no should, and there's no oughtness. I think in morality for an atheist. And excuse me.
I think atheism falls into like convention, like we're saying. Like I have the same kind of concepts or ideas when it comes to say politics, for example. Sometimes through my college years, I kind of developed a lot of libertarian ideas. And when I say the word libertarian, they say instantly, oh, you must be for drugs and prostitutes. And it's like, no. We don't have to jump to that extreme. I think the same thing happens with atheism. Someone will say they're an atheist. And they say, oh, you must be a hedonist. You must be just completely derived by your passions and desires. And I think that's the same kind of error. I think ultimately, like you just mentioned, that atheists really have the cultural education, and that's what shapes their sense of ethic or morality is cultural norms, and they may find themselves being more stringent, and they feel that's their version of piety, and but ultimately it becomes a little bit relative. Like for instance, I've always heard the example. Sure. Let's say you own a construction company, and there was a terrible, terrible storm that destroyed a whole village. That seems terrible. That seems very terrible for the people, even evil for the people. But then you get the contract to rebuild all the homes and businesses, and it's the best thing that's ever happened to you in your whole entire business. So now this is good for you. So was this event good or evil? And I think when you put those in those smaller contexts, I think that's where this gray area becomes, and people, depending on what side of the fence you are on, whether you're a homeowner or the contractor, all of a sudden good and evil become two heads of the same coin.
Becomes relative depending on who is experiencing it from what direction. And I just want to say real quick hello to Rick and my sketchbook. They're in the audience once again this week. Our two faithful listeners so far. We're sketchbook. You came in a little bit late. We're talking about the Crime Syndicate, but specifically the JLA Earth 2 story with Grant Morrison and Frank Quietly. And it's such an interesting book because it has a examination of morality. Whether it was intentional or not by Morrison, I don't know, but that's what always stood out to me about the book. I don't really even remember why Brainiac was doing what he did or what he was trying to accomplish. I don't remember the story so much. I just remember what always sticks out to me is this idea of the moral questions that are posed. So we have the good universe, the JLA, the evil universe, the Crime Syndicate, and then we have the neutral universal evil of Brainiac, and he's universally evil by both universes standards, only from the standpoint that he effectively has a chance to kill everybody. So we
one thing in the story. real quick, one thing in the story that was interesting. I actually didn't read the whole entire book, but I was able to view some pages online and get some synopsis. One thing that I found interesting was that when I believe it was 3 of the JLA members went into this inverted world and began to fix it, and ultimately came to the idea that they really couldn't, that this was kind of something that was in motion, and this inversion was always going to be the case.
Right.
I think you alluded to that earlier.
Yeah, and that was the problem. And Batman goes to Gotham and says, "Oh, Gotham is this Gotham is just like my Gotham. It has the same problem. It's corrupt. The police are embattled by Owlman. Well, that's fine. Owlman isn't here, so I'll start giving the police more control." And what he doesn't realize is the police are just as evil. They're just another mob. They're just another gang. And he takes him a while to realize that. So it's interesting that the JLA have a little bit of a wake up call with the way this world works, but ultimately you can't have. See, what I found interesting was that the Crime Syndicate universe implies that the JLA universe, the moral reality they live in, the things they consider good and things they consider bad, it's a kind of programming. They don't have free will. Good and bad are defined, and good and bad can just be defined however you want to. Sometimes they can be the same, and sometimes they can be opposites. It just depends on what universe you come from. And so it makes you wonder, like, the Crime City universe still seems to have religion, right? But what kind of religion? Now, you and I know, I think everybody knows, that if you look at the history of mankind, you can't say that good always wins. A lot of times, good does not win. So a lot of times, the innocent suffer, and the heroes die, and the people who you want to win don't win, and that's how life is. And would you have a funny thought or?
Something just hit my memory. I was having a conversation with a family member one time, and I was down on. I mentioned something about the Crusades in a negative light, and the family member was like, "Wait, I thought the Crusades were a good thing." This person being of Catholic persuasion, and I said, "Well, I thought for a minute. I said, well, I guess it depends on whose side you're on."
That's right. Well, it's always that way, right?
I mean,
if you're a German in World War II, what's wrong with killing Jews, right? Not all Germans felt that way, but it's certainly with a broad general, in Europe, I think that But anyway, I don't want to get into that, but but it's this interesting thing that you have to wonder then. Well, if the Justice League universe is programmed and good and evil are defined in these certain terms, and the Crime Syndicate universe is defined, is programmed to think about good and evil in these certain terms. So ultimately, in both universes, good always wins, right? Right. It's just that good has a different definition in the two universes. The principle is the same. Good always wins. Evil eventually perishes. It doesn't succeed. It's just they define the terms differently. And this is an interesting thing. This is why you talk about the 7 universal laws of Noah, and in college, I did a lot of reading of natural law, and I know there are different people who think that Noahide laws are Judaism's version of natural law. Yeah. I've never really totally agreed with that, and the reason for this is when you talk about universal laws, and you want to say natural law, which are those things that are obvious from nature. Like it's obvious that you don't steal, and you don't kill, and you don't do this, and you don't do that. Yeah, it's obvious you don't do those things, but the problem is that what is stealing, what is killing,
Right.
right? Because different uh, societies, different cultures have their own definitions of those terms. Rick, I don't quite get your. I think you have a typo. I'm not sure I understand your question. Um, you clarify a little bit, then we'll come and try to answer your question there. Um, so, what was I saying? Do you remember what I was saying?
I think you're talking about the idea of natural law. How
all right, natural law
doesn't seem to be
right.
completely analogous with universal ethics, which pretty much is my world. I spend all my time reading about ethics, and I think that it kind of becomes this interesting idea. I think classic philosophy, really comes up through Greek philosophy. Then it kind of follows over into more Enlightenment thinking, which really wanted to reject divine revelation and somewhat take it toward reason,
Right.
which is rather innate than empiricism, things we can put in test tubes, things we can measure, things we can know. And I think there's definitely when we talk about knowledge, there's a lot of different concepts of knowledge. I mean, certainly there's the stuff that we can know through measurements and through logic, and that's certainly an education through natural means, through natural law. There's also the education which religious people would kind of accept, and that is from revelation, from a divine source, that somehow all of creation has a purpose. And just really to throw out a fun thing, if we look at Bereshit or Genesis 2:7, it says that He formed man, that is, God formed man. And you'll never see this in the English, but if you read it in Hebrew, you'll see there's 2 yods in the word, and there's a conversation that each yod stands for desire or impulse, and that man has 2 impulses. That is, impulse for self, impulse for more magnanimous action, and that this is ultimately our struggle in life, right? That we do have free will, that we're not just an animal. Animals have no laws. Animals can take from each other. Animals can have relations with one another. Animals don't necessarily, have good and evil. There's no courts for animals. Whereas human beings, one of our purposes here is to be more than an animal, right?
Sure.
And so I think there's one level of natural law or universal ethics, and there's that second law of somewhat, divine. There's this propensity to want to seek purpose in life. And I think that's where humans, we read a book like this, and I think it really becomes evident that, that decision-making is important. That one's ethical system and methodology is certainly important, and it creates the world and the space in which we all live.
And I think that's why I like this book so much, is that it gets you thinking. And again, I don't know if this is on purpose. Like ever since I saw Matrix and in the sequel to it, I always suspected Matrix was an accident, because everybody kept going, "Oh, well, this is in line with Kabbalah," and the Christians said, "Well, this is in line with the New Testament," and then the Hindus would say, "Oh, this is in line with," and everybody was like claiming it, right? And I was like, I have this feeling that those guys wrote a story about cool things that people do when they're in leather, and everybody read into it more than they meant, and that was proved by the sequels, which was they tried to sound deep, but they kept failing at it. It just came off as just pretentious nonsense. And so I don't know if Morrison meant to make this a thinking book, but it's just so interesting that you have ultimately Superman is representative of power to protect, and Ultraman is representative of power to possess. And this is the two different uses of power and the viewpoint of what the power is for. And I don't know. I find that extremely fascinating. Um, and Lex Luthor, in some ways, you want to call him the hero, but he's not a hero. Lex Luthor can't be the hero. Rick said, "I believe good and evil were the same in both universes." Kind of. I mean, because I think the limitation of Morrison's ability to communicate the idea is too complex. If we try to rethink everything, like you do have this idea where they realize that they're doing bad things, and this is where you have this rule of thumb that evil wins in their universe and good wins in our universe. But ultimately, evil in their universe is actually good. So really, good and evil, good is supposed to win in all universes. It's just that the two universes define good differently. They define evil differently. And that's what makes it kind of interesting. And it poses a question. Like, is there in fact a notion of good and evil that ought to run through all universes? So if God exists, and then every time God creates a universe, and I'm throwing a bunch of science gobbledygook in with religion and everything like that, but just to examine this a little more philosophically, if there's such a thing as a multiverse, and we say God exists, then in every version of the multiverse, we should assume that moral values are the same because it comes from the same source. So we wouldn't expect to see a Crime Syndicate would be impossible. Excuse me, as far as them being programmed to actually, believe evil is good. That should be impossible. So this, in one hand, makes it if good and evil are relative, like this is what the series sets up, then what your universe winds up morality wise is just luck.
I think you're right.
Yeah.
I think a world is untenable in this way. I mean, it's completely inimical to existence to have this dynamic inversion, the way it's said. What's interesting is Ultraman makes an appearance in Grant Morrison's run on Green Lantern a couple years ago. Mm-hmm. I believe it's season 2 of Grant Morrison's run there. Green Lantern is one of my favorites. Everybody knows that by now. So of course it comes up a lot, but the story had some of the same ideas. He kind of played with versions of people and reality a little bit. And the only issue I had was the artwork was appealing to the eye, but it was so avant-garde that I found myself having a struggle with the storyline because the story was so dynamic and I didn't feel like the pictures really captured and was able to tell the tale. Because sometimes you really look to the pictures to kind of fill in the gaps. And the scenes by Liam Sharp were so serene and colorful and whimsical that I just didn't feel like it was conducive to storytelling. It was more, just artwork for the sake of artwork. That's my own opinion, whatever. But what I'm saying is Grant Morrison continues to play with some of these ideas. And I think his run on JLA, you go into the comic shop and you ask about JLA, one of the first names that's going to come up is Grant Morrison. His run on JLA is like top 10 of the runs. I think Mark Waid had it for a while too, which is another strong offering. So it's not like this was just some outlier by Grant Morrison. What I'm saying is these concepts continually run through some of his books as far as I can tell. Now, I don't exactly remember I think he did a run on X-Men, and I don't know if I read a lot of them or even own them. Probably after this broadcast, I'll go and look through some of my boxes in the archives. But I don't know if his play on conceptualism, on good and evil, I'm not really sure. Maybe other people would know if this is something that what I'm saying is I've seen it in other places, but I don't know if this is completely consistent throughout his work.
Do was meant to be good. What is do, Rick? You keep using do.
Do.
For me, real about CSA stuff, they knew it was bad, just didn't care. They cared more about power, really like bad people in our world. The problem is that everybody was like that, though. It wasn't just the Crime Syndicate. It wasn't like there are plenty of stories in DC where a character who's traditionally good becomes evil, and they just decide I'm going to take over. That was the whole thing with what was it, the Superman story where Superman becomes evil. Injustice, right? The whole Injustice storyline is Superman, a traditionally good and moral person, ends up becoming evil because of this traumatic experience he has as a result of Joker tricking him into killing Lois. That is one way of looking at moral issues, and it's more interesting to why did that individual fall? Why did such a lofty person fall and become the opposite of what he'd always been? Where the Crime Syndicate is a completely different situation, which is the very universe seems to be programmed to be evil, and not because people have had different experiences. Okay. It's not because they had a series of experiences and that led them down to choosing evil over good. It's because the way they defined good was actually how we would define as evil. Morrison doesn't do that because it's too hard to write that. I think that would just confuse everybody. I think that's why you see the him using terminology where it seems like everybody understands what they're doing is ultimately evil, and just don't care about it. But I think if we were, I think that if we were to write the story in a consistent way, the values of people in that universe would just be completely different from our values. And it seems like Grant Morrison wants to say that on one hand, these are morality is a construct. On the other hand, we have no free will, and so what determines the construct is the chance that we have in development. It's interesting to me that there's only one Crime Syndicate universe. There's not a multiverse of Crime Syndicate universes, right? But there's a multiverse of JLA universes, and I think that's a very interesting thing. Why is that? Is it because a Crime Syndicate universe is going to fail to reach the point of civilization that a JLA universe can get almost completely all the time, and you're going to have a much less likely successful story with this? I think that, so anyway, so this is why I think that this is a really interesting way of telling the story. I don't know. You've read more stuff. I haven't really paid attention to them. I just know in this particular book, it really caught my attention, and I kept and I always think about it because he did such a great job of representing these two very opposite universes where morality is thrown on its head, and you ultimately have to ask yourself, what's more, what is it? And then he throws in a third situation, which is Brainiac, and Brainiac is Brainiac is a computer, and he believes ultimately logic is universal. The only universal thing to Brainiac is mathematics and logic, and that's the only so the only constant that actually exists through both universes is logic.
It's funny if we juxtaposition, what we're talking about currently with our recent program on Age of the Apocalypse. In Age of the Apocalypse, good and evil seem to be the same thing. It is the inversion of the individuals, or the whatever, nature or nurture, whatever you want to say. But the characters themselves are different, and up is still up and down is still down, but it's a completely different world we're living in, where we're talking about the Crime Syndicate world. The world itself seems to be tipped on its head.
Yeah.
In that not only are the characters themselves, different, but the situations and almost the fabric of society is somewhat different. So it's a really, and that's what got me. I mean, the story itself, I mean, as far as I can tell, it was really good, and I enjoyed kind of picking through parts of it, the highlights of it. But what completely came out to me was this idea of good and evil, how it really, and I just want to go back to, that's what comics is to me, or that's what comics are to me, are the clash of strong ideals. We get to, have this malleable, universe, and we get to play with different concepts and watch them out to their logical conclusions, or maybe even illogical conclusions at times. But it's a clay that we get to mold and we get to play with and see what comes out in the end.
Right.
We have, like, Marvel does like What If comics, and DC will do like Elseworlds, and some of those were extremely fun because you got to see, one maybe spark of the imagination taken in a completely different zone, or what if this had happened, or what if, so I think these are concepts that the comics should play with, versus maybe some of the stuff we're reading now is all very culturally relevant, but I think it gets lost in the overall arching concept of what are comics, and that is the ultimate expressions of good and evil, of right and wrong, and the clashes therein. And then, like, for instance, I always loved Detective Comics with Batman, because he's crime fighting in a way that he has to sort through and analyze data, and I think that is intriguing. I call him the Great Detective, of course, and so it's these aspects of analyzing, having this analytical idea about the world. And I think that's what really comes over to me in this book, is that not only are we changing the characters, but we're changing the fabric of society, and even that is such a positive, or a powerful concept. And I think it really begs the question, like, are morals relative? Is the fabric of society so gentle? I mean, we have, like, for instance, Hegel is going to come and say, we need a strong state, we need a strong institutions, because these are the pillars of culture in which educate the masses, and Torah im derech eretz, this idea of that that the culture has some sway and on the individual, and making a positive culture makes for a positive outlook on society.
All right. Just to get to a comment real quick, Rick says they sort of did multiverse for CSA stuff with the dark multiverse and metal stuff. Yeah, I guess you could say that. I haven't read any of that. I don't know. I'm more or less not a collector anymore. I haven't collected comics since 2008, so I don't really know what's going on generally. But at the time that I bought this, there was no Crime Syndicate universe. And honestly, their dark metal universe and all that is just really, they don't know what else to do. They just wanted to do something crazy different for a little bit so they could make some more sales. But for this right here, this, I guess, maybe you've disproved my point about those universes won't work. I ultimately don't think they would work, and I think that was, if the universe is a result of chance and chaos and in micro determinism, as we have scientists claim, then I guess maybe a Crime Syndicate universe could happen and would be possible. But I really don't think it would survive. I don't think that the humans would be able to survive in it. You ultimately have to have values that keep humans from acting horribly. And horribly means destructive, self-destructive. John Locke talked about a social contract. Social contract is where the reason that we get along and don't kill each other is because ultimately we recognize I don't want to die. And even though I might be the guy with the strongest arms and the most gun, I have a lot of guns and I'm very strong. If enough people gang up on me, I'm dead as well. So it's in my best interest to agree to certain rules with everybody else. And that in that situation, the law then is truly powerful, and it keeps the weak and the strong from tearing each other up, because you know you can have a strong individual, but they're weak against the mob. You can't have that in a crime syndicate universe. Crime syndicate universe, everybody understands that they're there to take advantage of other people, and that ultimately any agreement they come to is not going to have any sort of lasting power, because they're just gonna, they're gonna. How would parenthood work? Ultimately, being a parent is one of the greatest acts of selflessness that you can do. Marriage wouldn't work because marriage requires two people to stay together and have love and to not only look for their own good but for the other person's good. You can't establish a family unit. You can't establish a family unit. You're definitely not going to establish a society. You would never be able to get out of the Stone Ages. You'd always be stuck with with flint rocks as tools and weapons, because nobody would be able to cooperate. So a crime syndicate universe is impossible. If not for the question of God, it's impossible because humans would just never be able to get along well enough to accomplish anything. We see that with the Tower of Babel, Tower of Babel, that human beings were extremely industrious and worked together and were accomplishing incredible things. Excuse me. But then they were doing it in the name of, they're accomplishing the wrong things. And so ultimately, how do you solve this problem? You confuse the language. People can't communicate with each other. It turned violent. My ideas aren't the same as your ideas. My words aren't the same as your words. I don't understand you. I'd rather, it's easier to kill you. And then society falls apart. So Tower of Babel shows you what happens when people can't communicate and can't work together. Society falls apart. And with the crime syndicate universe, society never begins. It can never begin anyway.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder if I just had a baby. Okay, I'm a mother, right? I'm in the crime syndicate universe. I just had a baby. Well, why do I want this? I have to take care of the baby. I have to feed it. I have to teach it. I have to look out for it. Mm-hmm. That's not my best interest. My best interest is to just fling the thing aside and go on with my life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I wonder if this is somehow an extension of Thomas Hobbes's philosophy of what is good, the avoidance of pain, and the the seeking of pleasure, mm-hmm. in a very individualistic terms, versus it seems to be like, because we're just having social problems in America, is somewhat of a breakdown of the fabric, and I wonder if it's not because of some of these commonalities. That we're thinking more individualistic and less of the whole, and the whole being, not necessarily what's good for the whole, but as in what wholly is good. What is good for the good for the society. Is it good that we make fun of our presidents and congressmen every day? Is it good? Is it good to to call policemen or police people, to call them murderers when maybe they feel like they're doing their job. It's like there's always two sides to everything is what I'm trying to say. And I feel like the gray is becoming less and less unclear, and this idea of apologetics, of even seeing someone else's side a little bit and having to argue for a rational position versus just saying, well, I'm right and I reject anything else that doesn't conform. my ideas. I had this fascinating. We're talking about good and evil, and completely aside from the the dualism of, let's say, Christianity has, that there's somehow there's the prince of darkness, there's somehow there's this plan, and that the secular society is somehow evil. The Jewish concept is very different, and I'll quote Rav Hirsch on this, and he says the Jewish concept of sin is overstepping divinely set limits. Everything, including the most physical phases of our lives, is sacred and good as long as it unfolds within the limits set by God. There's nothing in man that can be regarded as absolutely good or even absolutely evil. There's nothing in God's law that commands the destruction of any human potential. The law only directs that it be kept within specified limits. Only when these are overstepped or possibly not attained does a human act become a sin.
It's interesting that you put that you read that, because I think I can give an analogy. It's if you watch a comedian that you like in a movie, and the movies where the comedians their comedies to burn and fail are the ones when they had the most freedom to do whatever they wanted to. They were the least restricted.
Mm.
It seems like for some reason with comedians, it's better to have somebody who limits them and contains them, because not everything is funny. Not everything that's funny to you is going to be funny to everybody else. And there is, I guess, this notion that with law that those constraints are meant to point you in a certain direction, to raise your God consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why, B'nai Noach and Jews, even though there's a difference in the laws, the number of laws and types of laws, that ultimately it aims in the same direction, and we're able to arrive at the same point.
Right.
But that's very interesting.
Well, it really, parallels with a lot of the things I've been reading or have studied over the years. This idea that when God wanted to affect the world, he created, that is Israel, a nation, not necessarily a religion. Israel was given, commandments, not dogmas. And so even with the rest of the world, rather than create religions, this is something I'm passionate about, rather than create religious ideas and concepts and ethereal type ideas, creating nations, building civil societies, should be the goal, of ethical individuals, or even every individual. And I think it's books like this that it kind of slaps you in the face that, wow, like even when things are terrible, seemingly in our world, I mean, you look at a world like this, you look at the Crime Syndicate and how absolutely terrible it would be if Superman was evil, how absolutely terrible it would be if Wonder Woman was evil, whatever our conceptions of good and evil are, if they were to turn. And I've even mentioned this before, this idea that this tension between Batman and Superman, it comes up a lot, that Batman has this fundamental skepticism about Superman, that if he was ever to go rogue, how would they be able to stop him? So
I want to know that, just a funny point. Have you ever noticed that he always worries about that with Superman, but not with the Martian Manhunter, and all the other zillion other characters who have,
100%.
I think with Superman it's a solvable problem because he can just grab a chunk of kryptonite and whack him in the head with it, and Superman's taken care of. But he spends a lot of time. Of course, I'm joking about that. I think it's more because, Superman represents the ultimate good. What would happen if he became the ultimate evil, which he does in Injustice, the Injustice series. But let's see here. Rick says the CSA universe is everyone giving into the sin nature most of the time. But I guess that's the point. The point is the way it's set up. It's not that they're giving into it. It's programmed that they're programmed to see evil as good.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's the problem. But maybe even in the CSA universe, people might work together if they get something out of it. Well, that's sort of what Grant Morrison tries to say. he says that, you know, you have this their system. It's a system of favors. Their society works in a system of favors.
Hmm.
And I don't know why my thing went all blurry all of a sudden. Maybe because I'm moving around a lot. But ultimately, that stuff doesn't work, because why not just steal what you want?
Hmm.
Why not kill for what you want? You know, but you know, and the reason. Oh, shoot. Oh, we're out of time. Actually, that is 10 o'clock. We need to get going. Uh, he just needs to grab a lighter for the Mercy Man. That's right. Okay, guys. Well, thanks for listening to Overthinking Comics. I'm sure that you were going, gosh, what's with all the philosophy, right? Why aren't we talking about comic books, for goodness sake? Well, it's because this is Overthinking Comics, not just thinking about comics. Overthinking means that we go places that maybe you weren't expecting us or you think we should go, but that's where we go. We're going where no comic book fans have gone before. Probably not. But anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed it. We'll see you guys again next week at 9 o'clock. Israel time, 2 o'clock Eastern Standard Time. And see you guys later.